This week on the Frame Savers, we use our heads. Welcome to the Frame Savers. We are a retro video game podcast that focuses on speedrunning. Speedrunning is a hobby where we try to beat video games as quickly as possible using whatever tricks, glitches, and strategies we have available to us. And this is episode 84. Yes, 84 of the Frame Savers. Bad Games number 11. We've done 11 of these podcasts focused on bad games, and this one might be controversial to some people, but we're talking about the Bonk games. And we have categorized them as bad games. And I see people in the chat angry. People are throwing things, but that's okay. We'll go over all the Bonk games and tell you why they're bad. But thank you to everybody who's here. We're live on twitch.tv/theframesavers. Thanks for hanging out. And before we dive into Bonk, how are you doing, bud?
I'm doing pretty good. Time really does fly when you're spending time with people you love, and we're episode 84 now. So I mean,
yeah.
Boy, it's strange scrolling through our list of episodes, and I start at the top of the list every time because we have this giant Google Doc that we use for keeping track of absolutely everything. And now it's a very surreal feeling every time we need to add something to that list, scrolling and scrolling and scrolling and scrolling to get all the way down to where we are now. It really puts into perspective how crazy this process has been, but we're here. Things have been going good for me. I haven't done as much.
It feels like barely more than 200 episodes to me, so
it really does.
Tolerable to me.
Yeah, I feel like my perspective of, it doesn't feel like all that much when you're with people you like. I feel like that explains why it feels like 200 episodes.
Yeah.
But it's been pretty good. I haven't done a ton of speedrunning lately. I've been actually just no-lifing Ace Attorney. I actually did some speedrunning last night, practicing Bram Stoker's Dracula for the NES hard mode again, but I'm getting back into the swing of things. I just kind of needed a little bit of a break, but we're in it. We're loving it.
What amount of gameplay experience with Ace Attorney do you have to hit to actually get like licensed as a lawyer? Like what does the bar require for the amount?
I'm already partner at my firm.
Oh, nice.
You don't understand. Ace Attorney really goes in. If you're good at Ace Attorney, if you can demonstrate proficiency through Ace Attorney, I think you're automatically licensed. They just mail it directly to your house.
That's awesome and makes me feel really, confident in our legal system. So that's great.
Yeah, you're in good hands. You're in really good hands. I'm only licensed to practice anime law. That's the only thing.
Okay. Yeah.
So I guess that's the one downside. How have you been?
I'm doing good. I've been speedrunning a bit. I know that's a rare thing for me to say, but I've been working on Parasite Eve, the new game category, and that's been a lot of fun. Gotten a couple of runs completed so far, and pushing towards that sub 3 hours. I just got a PSP and all the doohickeys I need to run it, 2 minutes faster than I can on PlayStation because they don't have different leaderboards. So thanks for taking all my money, Parasite Eve leaderboard. But no, and I've been going through a lot of my collection. So I've been paring down, doing a little minimalizing, selling some games. So I've got a lot of store credit now to East Starland, so free PSP for me, But I've been mostly focused on that. I'm really enjoying it and hoping to grind it a bit more before I move on to something new. But enjoying doing some speed runs again for sure.
That's good. Yeah, I've been enjoying watching your progress for Parasite Eve. You put up a time pretty quickly, and you were like, well, this is fun, but I don't know how much longer I'm going to be going with it. And then, like, the very next day, you're like, on that grind for the sub 3 hours.
Yeah, that's me. That's the way my brain works.
That's good, though.
Yeah, it'll be good. I don't think I'm going to be pushing for, Palmer's time or anything, but I'd like to get, a top in the top okay-ish range, 5 or so. I don't know. We'll see. So,
The hallmark
um,
of a good speedrunner is the inability to think of anything but speedrunning.
yeah, absolutely. So, if you are looking for new speedruns to watch, definitely recommend checking out Really Really Longathon 2, which is a really cool speedrun marathon because it features a lot of these really long speedruns that generally don't get, emphasized in a lot of marathons. It's really hard in a GDQ. I mean, GDQ's been doing it a little bit more, but for the most part, it's really hard for, a game like Final Fantasy 9 or these 10-hour speedruns to make it into one of those marathons because you could fit in another 20 normal runs into your event. But this lets those runs get featured. It's going to be December 1st to the 15th on Speed Gaming 2, and definitely recommend checking that out
It's
for
really
sure.
it's really going to cut into their Link to the Past randomizer to have Speed Gaming 2 taken away for 2 whole weeks, but
Whew.
I
Yeah,
just
but
I
they got
suddenly
9 of
just
them. They got 19 of them, something like that.
I
So they'll
just
be
got the
good.
name of their marathon, really really longathon. It's cuz the runs are really long. So,
Oh, and it's a thon. That's
right,
the
like a marathon.
it's a thon, but it's
Right.
it's a long one. Huh.
John, why are
Nice.
we talking about Bonk today?
Well, Bonk is a game that there's more than one game, and they were made for multiple systems for you to play as interactive software, and you
We
could
plan
purchase
out
them at the store.
we plan out a lot of these episodes way in advance. So sometimes after we get done recording an episode, we'll sort of just have a meeting where we plan out like what's going to be the topic of our next 4 or 5 episodes. And when I mentioned doing an episode on Bonk as a bad games episode, John was like, yeah, sure, that makes sense. But as the time grew nearer and nearer, I could tell he was cursing me under his breath. He's like, why do I
Mhm.
have to play Bonk? Like,
Not a
don't
big
make
Bonk
me do
fan.
this.
I will start this out by saying I don't know that this should be labeled a bad games episode. Like,
Yeah,
I
I
think
kind of
this is a
agree.
thoroughly mediocre game. Like, this is exactly a 5 out of 10 kind of game. Like, this franchise has, strived for a long time for mediocrity, and it's hit the mark time and time again. And so I think that mediocrity should be appreciated.
That's
But
actually a
I
good
think,
point. It's like I you're right. This game is the perfect 5 out of 10. It has done nothing wrong. But I
but that's
also
the problem with
in
5 out of
turn
10. It's like more boring to be like being a mediocre game is worse than being a bad game, which makes it a bad game because it's a thoroughly uninteresting series. That's what I'm going to say. Sorry, I love all of you in chat that are excited about this episode.
yeah, I can hear the door swinging as we say all of this. It's like, "All right guys, bye."
Yeah, but we'll have good things to say about Bonk. They're interesting games for sure. There's a decent number of them, more than I even realized before we started planning this episode. I didn't realize there were all these Super Nintendo Bonks. I didn't realize, there were 3 TurboGrafx ones, and so these games are highly collectible as well. Some of them are pretty pricey games, so they've been on my radar for a long time, and a lot of collectors know about Bonk's Adventure's a very expensive NES game. The TurboGrafx games are not cheap, but you gotta pay for mediocrity in this world. So, but I'm excited to be done with this episode in about an hour and a half.
God willing, done in an
Yeah,
hour and a half. All right, so let's take a
absolutely.
quick break. We'll listen to a little bit of Bonk music, and when we get back, we'll talk about the whole series. That's right, the whole series. So rather than just talking about one Bonk game, we decided that the only appropriate way to do this would be to knock them all out at once so that we can forget this entire series exists. And so what we wanted to do is we wanted to give an overview of the Bonk games, because whether you like them or dislike them, I think one thing that you can say is that the Bonk games don't really deviate a lot from their formula. There is one pretty much set way that the games operate, and even though some of the games do mix it up in some interesting ways that we'll talk about, more or less, playing one Bonk game gives you a general sense of the entire Bonk franchise. Now, Bonk originally started out as a platformer series developed by the Red Company and published by Hudson Soft for the TurboGrafx-16. And in truth, this really is a mascot platformer in its truest sense. So Bonk was developed to be a mascot for the TurboGrafx-16. The series is known in Japan as PC Genjin, which is obviously a wordplay joke on the title of the console in international audiences, the PC Engine. So PC.
It's funny because it rhymes.
Yeah, basically that's what they're going for.
All good jokes rhyme.
Yeah.
All good.
I think you're confusing jokes for poems.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that happens sometimes.
So PC Genjin translates to PC Primitive Man. They sort of reverse engineered all of this. So PC Genjin means PC Primitive Man, and the PC stands for Pithecanthropus Computerus.
Wow, nailed it. That was pretty good.
Which is a play on the fact that the Neanderthal humans were Pithecanthropus erectus. So it's a fictitious species that's given for the name of Bonk. It was named BC Kid in PAL regions. We got Bonk. They had PC Genjin. So it was a different title for pretty much every region.
I'm really impressed that you were able to pronounce that. I mean, you couldn't pronounce mascot. I get that. But the fact that you were able to pronounce that, real impressive.
Well, I didn't practice mascot, but I did practice Pithecanthropus.
That's nice. In front of the mirror?
Yeah. Quite a few times I practiced it. I said it to myself. I tried it with funny faces. It definitely took the edge off.
Said it, in the drive-through ordering McDonald's. You just practice it in public too,
Yeah.
Nice. Well done. It paid off.
I work better in front of an audience.
Yeah, absolutely.
So this was originally started as a comic character for the PC Engine magazine. And a lot of people who saw it in that magazine thought it was already an advertisement for a game. But they ended up deciding to give him his own game series, and that's how we got Bonk. It was originally just meant to be a comic book character for the PC Engine magazine, but then it obviously got its own game in time. So this
game, I guess the first one came out for the TurboGrafx-16, was released in Japan in December of '89, North America in 1990, and then that game, Bonk's Adventure, was later ported to the NES, Amiga, and arcade under different titles, FC Genjin and BC Genjin. Also, I guess not ported. I don't know. There's a Game Boy one that's not really a port of this, but there's also a Bonk's Adventure on the Game Boy. And the back of the TurboGrafx-16 box says, "Bonk yourself out." Notice the play on words here happening, because that's also his name. "In this head-splitting adventure as Bonk the Caveman, use your head against Congozilla, Tractor Head," great name, "and the wackiest array of prehistoric foes ever seen. Be sure to eat your meat and vegetables as you power up to battle Evil King Drool himself. It's a real headbanger." 2 questions about this. First of all, did cavemen eat vegetables? They didn't have an agricultural system going on, did they?
I'm not sure. I mean, they were definitely hunter-gatherers, so they were definitely gathering berries and things like this.
Yeah.
I'm convinced that this game is just a marketing ploy by Big Food Pyramid.
Yeah, I could see that for sure. This game came out kind of in the heyday of this genre existing of caveman platformers. This was the hot. I'm saying this was the Space Marine of late 1980s, early 90s. You have Chuck Rock. You've got the Bonk series. What else do you have? I just thought of another one as well. Joe and Mac. I don't know. These were all these dinosaur games. The Flintstones was very popular around this time. Just I don't know what it was about cavemen, but we were just that seems like a great thing. Now we just do Space Marines. We're all in space, but. So yeah, but it's a platformer with cavemen.
Yeah, so this is the original game in the series, and obviously sets the formula in motion. You have limited health in the game. You start with 3 hearts, and as you take damage, you lose some of that health. You can also pick up heart containers throughout the game to give you more health capacity. You earn the health back by either picking up hearts or fruit and vegetables. Those are ways that you can earn back health in the game. Bonk's attack is primarily just with his head. So there's 2 buttons in the game. There's a jump button and there's attack button. So there's no run button. There is no run button, which is something that you really start to feel once you play the game.
You prefer there to be a run button, it sounds
I prefer for there to not be just one movement speed. I don't know.
Sure.
Just one movement speed alone is too few.
But you like Castlevania.
Oh, crap. You got me.
Wow.
Yeah, I guess I lose on that one. So when you're on the ground and you hit the attack button, Bonk just sort of lunges forward and headbutts enemies. But what really starts to make this game at least work a little more interestingly is that when you are in the air, you can flip over using the attack button to ground pound enemies. So you almost instantly lose all upward momentum and you start plummeting downwards very fast when you do that. And you can use that to attack enemies on the ground. So your head is virtually invulnerable. When you land on enemies, you bounce off of them and you flip back upright. So you can flip back again if you wanted to, but you can use this sort of bounce across enemies almost like in a Mario game. Also, what makes this kind of interesting is that when you flip in midair, no matter what your speed is, you temporarily stop falling just a little bit. So your movement, your downward speed is reset. And so you can actually flip consistently in order to float through the air. And so it depends on your ability to mash, but thankfully this does play off of the strength of the TurboGrafx-16 controller, because the TurboGrafx-16 stock controller actually has switches on it to turn on auto fire, which is one of the things that makes this a really interesting console. We'll talk more about that when we get to the speedrun discussion, but the stock controller having turbo built into it definitely informed the design of a lot of the games for this console. So
Yeah, and this game was invented before physics, right? Because
I'm pretty sure
that's why you don't drop when you do the spinnies in the air.
Right. Yeah, definitely. So this game.
Does Bonk's Adventure allow you to jump up and hit something from underneath? Like in some of the later Bonk games do that, but I didn't get to play much Bonk's Adventure.
Yeah, when you're underneath an enemy, you can actually jump up into them and bonk them upwards. And what's interesting about that is that that's just a normal attack you can use, but you can also, if you can juggle enemies over and over, you get big score bonuses. And score actually does matter in this game. If you hit certain score thresholds, you'll get extra lives, which can really come in handy. So the score ends up mattering in this game more than it does in more modern games. It sort of just has score as a legacy holdover.
For sure.
So other sort of movement things, you can climb walls with your teeth. So if you hit a wall, Bonk can climb walls. There's also these meat power-ups, which is I think what most people are most familiar with the Bonk games. So when you collect these meat power-ups, Bonk levels up, however you want to think about it. He has different leveled up forms. The first level of power-ups, you can stun enemies by pounding on the ground. And at your second level of power-up, you get temporary invulnerability. And your strength actually goes up as well. That may only be in the second game, actually. I'm not 100% certain, but I think in the first game as well, you do move a little bit faster, and when you attack, you do a little more damage. So that can make a real difference in your abilities. So what makes the power-up interesting is that unlike in a Mario game where when you get the Fire Flower or the Cape, you keep it until you get hit, in Bonk games, when you power up, unless you continue powering up, so finding more meat power-ups as you go, you sort of downgrade over time. So after, maybe 10 or 15 seconds, you downgrade to the next lowest form, and you automatically go back to basic Bonk, even if you haven't taken any damage. So
like reverse evolution.
No, evolution didn't exist back then. So
okay.
This was before we invented evolution.
This game series is actually cited for starting the whole keto craze as well, because of just the large amount of meat that you're eating.
Yeah, so I don't think that you eat any carbs in this game. So I would say that Bonk is, if you're on a keto diet, Bonk is a keto friendly game.
Yeah, absolutely. It really helps a lot to just make sure you're staying in ketosis. It's not going to knock you out. You're not going to hit many net carbs. It's great. It's perfect.
I would say in general, lives are pretty generous in this game. If you're willing to sort of hunt for them, there are lives in most of the levels. Hitting score thresholds give you lives. A lot of the bonus games, which we'll talk about in just a second, a lot of the bonus games, as a reward for completing the bonus game at the best possible level, it'll give you an extra life. So there's a lot of lives to be had if you're sort of on the search for them. And you can die pretty easily, I would say, so it's good to stock up on them.
Yeah, and you can also get fruit and hearts to get back health. Now you have to skip the fruit if you're doing keto percent because you can't have
Right.
too much fruit in keto.
That's
So
absolutely right.
I'm definitely gonna start doing some keto runs of Bonk. That would be great. Smiley faces, which are actually seen throughout the series in general, give points based on how many are collected per world at the end of each world. They actually get used for some different things later on, like in the SNES games and such. And you also have bonus games, which is kind of a staple of the Bonk series. The reward is usually smileys or in some cases one-ups, and there'll be platforming challenges, climbing challenges, flipping challenges, different things like that. And some of the later games, they have some wackier things where you have to use your head to maybe fill up a balloon all the way up until it shoots away, or take flowers and throw them into a basket. But the bonus game mechanic is pretty big in Bonk, it seems like. And most console platformers are actually exclusive to their console, but Hudson published this for multiple consoles, which is kind of cool. If you think about the the normal console mascots that you look at, you've got like Crash Bandicoot, you've got like the Mario games. They generally stay on the same if not the same consoles, at least the same company's consoles, but this kind of
Right.
jumped around from TurboGrafx, and also Nintendo, which is cool.
Yeah, this game did get a 2.5D. I guess you could think of it as a 3D remake. Hudson had released a best selection series, so it was kind of a greatest hits. This came out around the same time I think Sega was doing their Sega Ages series. And so they were re-releasing old games on newer consoles to bring attention to them, and they remade Bonk's Adventure for the PlayStation. It's pretty much just a port, not a particularly great port from what I was reading and the videos I was seeing, but it is just a port, and it's sort of just all of the sprites were replaced with 3D models, so they've got a lot more animations to them. There's a lot more going on. When Bonk turns around, he does like a full 3D turnaround rather than just the sprite flipping, things like that. It looks really good. The sound design is really nice in the new one, in the remake, but ultimately I don't think that it was really anything all that special. I will say that of the two games that I played, so I played Bonk's Revenge and I played Bonk's Adventure in prep for this episode, and I watched videos for all the rest of them. But for the two games I played, I really started getting into the mini games. I was like hunting them down and playing them because I was having a lot of fun with them. Bonk's Revenge I didn't love as much, but I did Bonk's Revenge first, and then I played Bonk's Adventure. And I was really getting into the Bonk's Adventure mini games. The flipping challenge, you start at the top of a cliff, and it says basically just keep flipping
Oh, yeah, yeah,
all the
yeah.
way down till you get to the bottom, and it counts how many times you flipped. But if you land on your head, you get zero, you get nothing. So you have to flip back into place before you hit the ground. And I was challenging myself on that, seeing how many I could get. I got like 100 and something flips by the time you hit the ground. I think that you have to
Wow.
get I think you have to get a pretty large number before it gives you a one up for it, though. It gives you smileys as a reward, but I think you have to get to like 100 before you get one up as a reward. It was
Do you like getting smileys as a reward?
yeah, it's a incentive structure. I appreciated it. But some of them were really straightforward platforming challenges. So it was like increasing distances between platforms, and you had to flip to get across the big gaps. Um, they were very simple, but they were fun. One of them was
Yeah.
just like climbing a wall. One of them was, so Bonk has this ability where if you're against a wall, you can kick off of the wall. And so it had this sort of narrow tunnel going all the way up to the top, and it was a challenge to see how high you could make it in that tunnel. They were all very, very simple, but they were fun, and they made me want to play more of them. I was like seeking out these flowers to go to the bonus games.
Yeah, it's interesting that you enjoyed Bonk's Adventure more. I didn't get to play the TurboGrafx games, but many people consider Bonk's Revenge for the TurboGrafx 16 the best Bonk game out there. I mean, they definitely up the graphics and some of the quality of gameplay. Again, all these games are going to be very samey. They're pretty similar. There's a couple of different variations, especially in the like Super Nintendo games that seemed a bit different. But this Bonk's Revenge for the TurboGrafx 16 was released in 1991, so only a year and a half later, depending on what country you're in. And eventually, it made its way to the Wii Virtual Console, Wii U Virtual Console, Japanese PlayStation Store. And in this game, great lore is that Bonk is on a quest to save half the moon stolen by King Drool the third, which I like because like he stole half the moon. I just don't
Yeah.
understand
Well, he
Like,
didn't
how do
need
you
the
do
whole.
that?
He's not wasteful. So the first game was all about ketosis. The second game is about being environmentally conscious. Like he didn't need the whole moon. You know,
Does he get rid of the dark side? He doesn't want the dark side of the moon? Because
they
that
say
guy,
like
that kind of makes sense.
like 30% of food in our world is wasted, and I think that's what the first game was really trying to focus on.
Okay.
In this one, it's about not trying to own too much land.
Sure.
And so King Drool was like, I need some space to build a castle on. And obviously he wants it in space. I think that
Yeah.
that one just makes sense. But he was like, a whole moon would be wasteful. There's another half here that someone else could use. Leave it in the fridge for someone to eat later.
Sure.
So
Do you think this game's like kind of like the anti-Manifest Destiny game?
yeah, absolutely, 100%.
Okay, makes sense. I think everybody is in agreement on there. So,
Yeah.
yeah. So this is actually considered by many to be the best in the series. Same style as before. The powered up bonks now have more abilities though. So the first power up shoots projectiles when bonk attacks. The second one shoots fire. And I guess Entertainment Weekly gave this game a B. So that's good to hear, right? I mean,
I didn't know
that's where I go for my gaming news.
Yeah, I saw this listed on their Wikipedia page for Bonk's Revenge, and okay, so they gave it a B. That's great, but the thing that really stood out to me is that Entertainment Weekly reviewed a video game, and I really want to know everything there is to know about this. Like, what was that about? How long did they do it? What games did they review? What were their favorites? I need to know, because
What's
now
weird
they're
is
publishing.
they gave it a B out of 15, which I didn't understand. That was an interesting call for them.
It's a strange scoring system. I just want to know, because right now they seem very focused on who's the hottest man in entertainment, and at the time, Bonk's Revenge got a review. So
huge missed opportunity. They should have rated it like a Jennifer Aniston or something. Like your Entertainment Weekly. Why are you using a rating scale? You have your own culture thing going on here. You're focused on, well, this is a Chris Pratt out of,
I thought I got hung up on this, but John is absolutely lost at this point.
It's like more like Chris Pratt in The Passenger and not in Jurassic Park.
I'm gonna have to.
That's where we should have gone.
I'm gonna have to keep going with this podcast. John's stuck here. So these are the two games that I played. I played Bonk's Revenge on the TurboGrafx 16, and I played Bonk's Adventure on the NES. And a lot of people were telling me that I really needed to try Bonk's Adventure on the TurboGrafx 16. But I had a great time with the NES game. It was very straightforward. I beat it pretty quickly. The Bonk's Revenge game, there's definitely a lot of neat ideas that they were going for. They definitely sort of fleshed out the level design a little better. They had these themed worlds, and the bosses were more clever in a lot of ways. But ultimately, I ended up enjoying Bonk's Revenge less. Like, I played through it, I game overed on it. I feel like if I had maybe played one or two more game overs, I probably could have beaten it. It wasn't a hard game, but I got walled off on the ice level pretty quickly. So, ice physics in a Bonk game aren't ideal. But ultimately, it was a really fun game. I would say that I can understand why Bonk's Revenge is considered to be the favorite. It's less simplistic in its design. Like they tried some new things, but I think that what I liked about the first Bonk game was that it was very simple. So
the good news, my man, is that if you want to get Bonk's Adventure for the NES, only costs $500.
That's it.
Yeah. So and you can play it as often as you want. So
every day. Every day is how often I want.
Yeah, that's not a bad deal. If you played it every day for a year, that's barely over $1 a day. That's a pretty good deal.
So there were
2 Game Boy games. I'm going to talk about this because I'm the Game Boy guy.
John's going to tell us all about the Game Boy games because he's actually played them. So
yeah, I've beaten both Game Boy games. It was a while ago. It was a podcast. It was for Game Boy Quest, and Bonk's Adventure on the Game Boy, very similar in style to Bonk's Adventure on the other systems on TurboGrafx and NES, but not a direct port. So just kind of a similar, I don't know what you'd call it. I mean,
yeah, you still got the power-ups, you still got the bouncing on flowers, but the level design is different. So
yeah, and then Bonk's Revenge had, was not a port as well. Like, what would you say? I didn't get to play it on TurboGrafx. Is it?
Yeah, it's not a direct port. It's similar, but this is one where they deviated from the source. So whereas Bonk's Revenge on TurboGrafx 16 was very much just a direct sequel of Bonk's Adventure for the TurboGrafx 16. I think, at least what I was reading about, Bonk's Revenge on the Game Boy has a lot more stuff to it. So there's like these 3 unique forms you can get. You can get like the Master Bonk, the Hungry Bonk, the Stealth Bonk, which are like It's very reminiscent of moving into Super Bonk 2. So we'll talk just very briefly about Super Bonk 2 in a second. But this idea that instead of just having like Bonk powering up, he's starting to have like costumes and abilities. So like
Hmm.
Master Bonk, he can run faster and jump higher. So that's like half of what the powered up Bonk was in the old games. There's Hungry Bonk, which has a stronger attack, which is the other half of that powered up version. And then there was Stealth Bonk, which could like enter these secret doors. He had like this the striped jail uniforms or jail outfits, and he could enter these locked doors. And when you went in them, you would either get things like a bunch of smileys, or you would get a piece of meat, or you would lose a bunch of smileys or stuff like that. It was sort of like almost a
And
gamble.
you're a big fan of smileys.
Yeah, I've been on the record so far as being pro smiley.
Yeah, that makes sense. Both these games are kind of just more of the same. I rated them. Guess what I rated them at for Game Boy Quest?
Dear God, please say 5 out of 10.
It was 5 out of 10. And then, but apparently Bonk's Adventure got a 5.5 out of 10. So maybe
Okay.
I liked Bonk's Adventure more. I don't know.
I looked at
But
the video of Bonk's Adventure, and all of the things that I was just saying positive about Bonk's Adventure on the NES slash TurboGrafx 16, how I thought it was simple, but I kind of liked how simple it was. It looked like the Game Boy version of it was a lot more of that. It was like the level design didn't really take any risks or anything like
yeah.
that, but it was just the very simple, cute platformer style that was already working for Bonk as it was. So
Yeah, they're definitely not bad games. I
no.
will have points to say about the controls later, which is one of my bigger complaints about Bonk. But ultimately, similar to a lot of Game Boy ports, they're not direct ports, but they're reimaginings on the Game Boy because of limitations with the hardware and such like that. The games that I played for the actual podcast were some of the Super Nintendo games. So there's a Super Bonk that came out in the US and also in Japan. But then in Japan, they also had a Super Genjin 2, which was a Super Bonk 2, essentially, that we never
Yeah.
got in the US. And those games definitely take a bit more of a diversion from the Bonk series. I mean, they're still really similar, but there's just aspects that feel different. When I first played Super Bonk, I felt like I was in a fever dream. Like I was just so confused because I was getting a power up like every 10 feet. Like it would just, I'd be, now I'm transformed to something else and something else. And it was very confusing. But that game is definitely more open than it is linear. Like most of the Bonk games are pretty clearly go left to right and exit the screen. And then it clearly tells you, okay, now you're moving on to the next section. But this was like, each time you moved to a new screen on the top right, it would give you the name of your new section. And so you kind of would be exploring your way through this world a bit. Like sometimes you'd climb really high and go up in the sky to a new area, or go down into the water and swim somewhere else. So I was confused. I would have to spend a bit more time with it than I did. I probably spent 30-45 minutes playing it, but it's definitely interesting. I would say like it's different than your standard Bonk experience, and maybe would be enjoyable. But ultimately, the game didn't really convey to me whether or not I was doing something correctly, so I didn't know if I was going in the right direction or what was happening.
This game
um
reminds me a lot of the other Super Nintendo games that were popular at the time. There was this single style that I don't know if I can even
yeah,
put into words. Like you're sort of like in the middle of a city and everything's in skyscrapers, and then
colorful.
it's
It's got this
colorful and
high energy, happy music, and so like it felt very super when I was playing it. So I was like, oh, Bonk, it gives me that feel of like all these other SNES games. I can't really pinpoint which ones I'm thinking, but I don't know, your smart balls and stuff like
mhm.
that. Like it just felt very
Yeah, I was
playful and
thinking like
fun.
We're Back at Dinosaur Story or Rocky
Yeah.
Road or games like that.
Yeah.
There's just like a bunch of them that all just feel very samey in that way. The some of the other things that they added in Bonk 1. So Bonk 1 definitely follows in the lineage of the other Bonk games. If you're already familiar with Bonk, this is going to be similar in a lot of ways. One thing that they did add were giant Bonk and tiny Bonk power-ups. So you
Yep.
can grow in size, or you can shrink to very small. And there's a lot of puzzles that play off of those elements. So things
Mhm.
like, being giant Bonk and knocking through walls and stuff like that, or being tiny Bonk and being able to go through small tunnels and things like that. They built a lot of the puzzle aspects, not necessarily puzzle, but progression in the platformers around those ideas.
For sure. And there's definitely different areas that you only accessed if you had little Bonk and you went through a small passage and, knocked through these rocks. And so it was very unclear to me whether or not some of these areas were optional or like what I was trying to get to. I didn't play it very long, but it was definitely more exploration based than a Bonk game generally would be. Super Ginjin 2, played that a bit. It uses this moon language a lot that I didn't understand. There's a lot of letters on there. I didn't know
John
what
and
was
I
going on.
sat in a call while he played it, and he's like, "Oh, here's a sign. It's entirely in Japanese. That helps me."
Yeah. Well, I mean, the menu's in Japanese, so like, I guess I just picked the first option, because that seems right. But I think that took me to a tutorial, and it had these books that would like basically tell me what the different moves were supposed to be for Bonk. Didn't help me very much. And then, but the game was it was similar to Super Bonk in terms of its like graphical style and music. Like that was all pretty good, but it seemed a bit more linear. Like it seemed a little bit more clear. Okay, you're progressing this screen. I fought some bosses, and it was a little bit more of a straightforward platformer. So those are pretty cool games. The Game Boy games are definitely also enjoyable. I mean, I guess we'll do I don't know how we're gonna do this review section. It's gonna be very interesting because there's a lot of games going on here, but good thing it's basically 7 of the same game. So
So,
what about Airzonk? Because I've heard of Airzonk.
well, before we do that, I did want
Okay.
to talk about Bonk 2 added some new power-ups and stuff. So there was
Oh yeah, yeah.
they definitely went in that same direction I was talking about before with Bonk's Revenge for the Game Boy. This idea that rather than just directly powering up, giving some unique abilities. And I found so I didn't play this game, but I did find some talk of a lot of these different power-ups. And I just wanted to mention some of them because some of them are really creative, very
Sure.
different. So there's things like frog goggles, which apparently give you a long tongue to grab walls and platforms.
I didn't get that one.
There's a drill hat that allows you to tunnel through rocks.
Mm-hmm.
There's a ballerina power up, which gives you the ability to double jump. And
And
there
you
were
got some on fleek makeup going on when you're ballerina Bonk too.
looking
So
good.
nice.
You gotta,
Yeah.
you gotta keep that makeup on point. You know.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, yeah, so let's talk about Airzonk. Airzonk is another series that's considered to be a spin-off of the Bonk series. It was PC Denjin Punkik Cyborg in Japan. PC Denjin obviously being yet another pun on PC Engine, the name of the TurboGrafx 16 in Japan. And it was released near the time of the release of the Turbo Duo. So the second game came out pretty near the time that NEC was releasing the Turbo Duo. And just like Bonk was used as the mascot for the PC Engine, Zonk was used as the mascot for the Turbo Duo. It was used in all the promotional material. It was used in the box art. So some things about this game series. So because this wasn't really an Airzonk episode, I just kind of wanted to offhand mention Airzonk, but I didn't go too deep into it. I don't think either of us played the Airzonk games. But so one thing I found when I was looking up information about it was that there's some relatively crude humor in the original versions that when it got localized were removed. So things like at the beginning of every level, the image that you see is this sentient pile of manure. There's this fusion ability where you can fuse with characters, and if you fuse with the cow character in localized region or in our region, it was you were holding milk bottles and you could like squirt them at enemies. But in the original Japanese version, it caused Zonk to grow breasts and shoot milk out of those.
As one does.
Like normal. And Zonk can also drop bombs, but in the original Japanese version, rather than dropping bombs, it was just him defecating. So they really went in. They had this
These are
idea.
shooters, right? They're like side-scrolling shooters, shoot 'em ups. Or...
I guess. I don't know. I don't know really anything about these games. I wanted to mention them as spin-offs, but I didn't get a chance to play them or watch them.
yeah. I
and
believe
so-
they're side-scrolling shooters, and they're pretty expensive. I mean, honestly, a lot of this Bonk series, like if you're a collector, like you're probably aware of these, like Super Air Zonk. If you want to get that like complete box, like you're looking at almost $1,000. So like it's one of those kind of sought-after, collecting items. And then like the TurboGrafx games. We didn't mention Bonk 3, Bonk's Big Adventure, but that game goes for like $400, or on Super CD like $800. So it's crazy. The Bonk games have been highly collectible, and so you might have heard of Airzonk because of that.
So I just looked it up. Airzonk is a side-scrolling shoot 'em
Yeah,
up, like you
what I
said.
thought.
And with all that we've
Like
said,
a cute 'em up, right? It's a cute 'em up.
yeah, kinda. I know exactly what you're saying, and yeah, it's exactly like that. With all the praise that I've just been heaping on it, I do want to mention that Airzonk won the Best TurboGrafx 16 award of 1992 by Electronic Gaming Monthly. So
What did Entertainment Weekly say about it, though?
You know, Entertainment Weekly was not available for comment, which is crazy.
Wow. They gave it a Courtney Cox. Courtney Cox in Scream, not in Friends.
Oh wow, yeah,
Yeah.
that's way worse. I'm sorry, you should have left it alone, but that's mean.
Did you get to play Bonk 3? Was that one that you got to play, or?
No, you and I talked about that one, but I don't think either of us played it. We also, neither of us played the other Game Boy game, the Japanese only game that was just made of mini games. So there's a lot of Bonk stuff.
And there's actually a significant amount of Bonk stuff that came out later for like iOS and mobile phone devices. So the Bonk series lives on apparently. I mean, the Hudson as a company is no longer really making games. I forget who owns their rights.
I believe it's Konami, and Konami now owns the rights to the Bonk series, but they haven't done anything with it. There were so like John was mentioning, there was a lot of games that came out afterwards. They were all mobile games, and I think some of them were just ports of the original games, but there were a bunch of games that came out in I think like 2008 or so for iOS, part of some sort of like package of Bonk titles. So there's a lot of those. And then there were 2 unreleased games. One of them was called Bonk 4 RPG Gaijin. So it was it was supposed to be an RPG of Bonk.
That would be awesome. I would actually kind of enjoy having been able to see what that would be like.
I actually included in our show notes a link to some promotional materials for that game. So
Nice.
if you want to check out what that game was all about, our $1 a month patrons get access to our show notes whenever episodes come out, and you can see all the promotional materials for the unreleased RPG that they were working on. There's another game too. So this RPG and another game they were working on. I think just the other one they were working on was supposed to be released for the Nintendo 64 and a bunch of other modern 3D consoles around that era. So like the PlayStation 2 perhaps. But that one got scrapped as well. Basically, there's not been any significant Bonk activity since Super Bonk and Air Zonk, if you want to count that as part of it.
Can you imagine a Bonk 64?
I would love that.
That would be really interesting and probably not very good, but it could be fun. You never know.
The transition would be really interesting for it, because I always thought that Mystical Ninja was kind of a so-so game, but the N64 game that they made was really, really solid, I thought. And
now, what if you put it in first-person perspective and each of those flips, the whole world flip up and down?
That would be vomit-inducing. I feel like you just get motion sick so fast.
Yeah, but it would be more realistic, and you would know what it's like to be. That's what he's living.
I don't want to. It's not just the flips. I don't want to know anything about how Bonk is living his life. There are so many questions.
Fair.
There are so many questions left on the table. I want to know nothing about them.
That's fair. That's fair. Well, unfortunately, Konami forgot what video games are, so we're probably not getting a new Bonk game anytime soon. But
Bring back Bonk.
I think we all had a middling amount of enjoyment playing these games, and we're gonna go ahead and take a quick break, listen to some of that music, and then go ahead and give you some ratings. So each and every week we like to do our ratings where we review the game that we're talking about, and we generally break it down into categories such as graphics, music and sound, controls and gameplay, difficulty and fairness, fun and replayability, and then give it a final score from 0 to 10. This is going to be a bit more of a challenge since we're discussing a whole series of games. However, since they're pretty similar, I think we can cover most of these topics, over covering all of them. But before we hop into those, we have a question here, and that is, how does Bonk rank in the world of mascot platformers? What do you think, Chad?
So the main thing that I would want to say is that I think that mascot platformers, you often think of just like Mario and Sonic, Crash Bandicoot, things like that, which are obviously pretty heavy hitters, but there were a lot of, every company sort of had their mascot platformers in this era. There was, Arrow the Acrobat was, which company was Arrow the Acrobat?
I'm not sure, actually.
Yeah, I suddenly forgot that one. And Bubsy, which I really like the Bubsy games, but whether or not you consider that to be a really strong mascot platformer is up to you. I would say that Bonk is really, as far as mascot platformers that are tied to a console, pretty low quality, but in terms of just centered around a company, which was for Hudson Soft, and the fact that it was on multiple platforms, I would say that they did a really good job of making the experience consistent across the platform. We joked about the fact that it's consistently mediocre, but I think you'd be hard pressed to argue that these games being out on different consoles, you didn't get a very consistent experience across all those different consoles.
It's weird, like the concept of a mascot platformer, and maybe this is for another time, is a bit confusing. Like, I don't know what delineates between them, and not, I don't think most people consider Mega Man to be a mascot platformer, for example, but it's basically the same thing, right? I don't know if it has to be an animal, I don't know if it has to be like the way it looks, but Bonk's, middle of the road, just like basically everything we've been saying about it. I mean, you've got your Marios and your Sonics and your, Crash Bandicoots and stuff that are probably a little bit more successful. And then you've got, barely anybody remembers something like Arrow the Acrobat. Most people haven't played the Bubsy games or don't have a lot of fond memories of them. At least most people are pretty negative on them. So I would say it kind of fits right in the middle between kind of the really successful ones and the ones that kind of flamed out enough so that they made 8 games or so, which is pretty substantial for a mascot platformer. I mean, how many Bubsy games were there?
Quite a few. 5 before
5.
they finally decided to kill it.
There was one Arrow the Acrobat game. What other?
No, there were 2 Arrow the Acrobat games,
2.
but it was
Okay.
Acclaim as far as I'm seeing. There was like Gex. The Gex series were
Gex,
mascot
that was
platformers.
way less successful than Bonk, I would say. I mean, there's just not many games, not a
Yeah.
lot of, traction there. You got Spyro. I mean, like PlayStation kind of had its own generation of ones in a whole different genre. But in terms of like the 2D platforming mascots, Bonk did all right, I'd say. It lasted a decent
Gex
length.
deserved everything that happened to him. I mean,
Wow.
you design a character around being intentionally obnoxious, and you kind of reap what you sow. You know what I mean?
But you love Bubsy, who's not obnoxious at all, right? I mean, his personality is just,
All right. Well, I mean, touche. I really have no response. You're right. Yeah.
Yeah, that was a good little question to segue into this. But going over the Bonk series again, we're going to be talking about these kind of in a general sense, since we can't go game by game. But what do you think of Bonk in terms of its graphics?
I think for most of the games, except for the ones that got really downgraded, like when it got ported to Game Boy or when it got ported to the NES, I think that the graphics are fantastic. It's really bright, really colorful. They obviously were going for a really cartoony, fun style, and that reflects in not just the levels, but in like boss design and character design. When you pick up a power up, like getting the meat power up, it does this really over the top animation of his like head popping off, and he like jumps high into the air and gets so excited. It's I don't know, they just did a great job graphically, I would say.
Yeah, the Super Nintendo games as well were really nice graphically. I felt like they were a pretty big upgrade over obviously the experience I had had on the Game Boy, but also over the NES version and the like. It was really colorful. You know, you talked about how the second one, or no, the first, the Super Bonk, so hard to not mix these up in our heads. The one where he can grow really large and really small, you know, that does something really cool graphically to scale
Hmm.
Bonk up to this ginormous size that is still playable, and then this teeny tiny size, and you can still see, you know, some of the facial, reactions and things that are going on that Bonk does. Bonk does have a lot of like animations, like he does have these facial expressions and different things going on. So graphically, I think the game is all the series is pretty well done, and the Turbo Graphics had some pretty solid graphical capabilities, and especially Bonk's Revenge looked like a pretty sizable graphical upgrade from Bonk's Adventure on the Turbo Graphics, and did a really great job of fleshing out this very colorful environment and such.
It's also a good thing to note that this being the mascot platformer for the TurboGrafx 16, the game design itself really showed off a lot of what the TurboGrafx 16 was capable of. The Super Nintendo and the NES both had limitations on how many sprites could be on screen, but there were certainly levels in Bonk's Adventure, Bonk's Revenge, that just had like a ton of enemies on screen all at one time,
Mm,
and this was to show off that the TurboGrafx 16 could really handle all this stuff with almost no slowdown.
yeah.
So
Yeah, they're good looking games for sure, and I don't think graphics is an area they struggle too much in. I mean, they don't do anything crazy. They are platformers after all, but for the time especially, looked really good and great use of color. In terms of the music and sound, there are actually multiple composers across the series, so there's not really a consistent soundtrack or I don't know what I'm trying to say. Like
there's not a general sense that just like this
yeah.
is the bonk sound.
Yeah,
Um,
but there were some, I mean, I don't know. I got to play the Super Nintendo ones, which were really good musically. Like I thought they had some really nice soundtracks to it. Nothing that necessarily stood out that I would remember it and be like, "Oh, that's the Bonk song," but really felt like they tied together with the Colorful Worlds really well. In just the entire series, I never felt like any of the music was poorly done for sure.
Yeah, I found some of the music, at least in the games I played, to be somewhat unmemorable. But
Yeah.
the sound design itself was really solid. I enjoyed the sound effects. There were little jingles that happened. So like if you get fully powered up and you're in your temporary invulnerability, you get this little jingle that's pretty consistent across the series. And that was really good. I never disliked any of the music, even though it didn't have a consistent sound to it. I would say that all of the music was good.
Yeah.
But I didn't find it to be incredibly memorable.
Yeah, absolutely same thing. Enough that I don't have much more to say cuz I don't remember,
Nope.
but I did intentionally listen to it for the podcast and was like, "Oh, this isn't bad." But now I've already forgotten it.
I
So,
mean, I picked out music for the podcast and
yeah.
for the music breaks that we're having in the actual episode. I picked out arcade music because it was a little better fleshed out.
Sure.
But I went through several of the games and I couldn't find any that just had tracks that were just like, wow, this is really one that I want people to be listening to a lot. They were just kind of all over the
They
place.
missed an opportunity because you bang your head, and they should have had some metal in there. They should have
Real headbangers.
they
I mean,
missed out.
Chuck
They
Rock
missed out.
based itself all on rock and roll music, so
Smart, because that's a pun.
yeah, I
Puns are
get it.
funny. Yeah. So controls and gameplay. Oh boy. Oh boy. I'm just gonna let you start with this one.
So John played ones that had a lot more slipperiness, which I didn't experience as much. So Bonk's Revenge has ice levels that actually end up using the ice, I feel like, in somewhat clever ways. So the game in general never felt slippery to me, but for the ice worlds, it really played against your instincts. So things like being comfortable with falling on the ground with your head. That's something that you sort of get used to. If you're flipping a lot, if you fall on the ground with your head, that's not a big deal. It just sort of slams the ground, and if you're powered up, it can do damage to enemies. But in the ice levels, if you hit the ground with your head, you just kind of slide around a lot, which can sort of get in the way of basic platforming. It can be kind of frustrating. Other than that, I found that the levels were designed in such a way to make the controls not too frustrating. I found the water levels in Bonk's Revenge, for instance, to be a little challenging to deal with because the water movement wasn't that great. But in general, the platforming was pretty straightforward, so I don't have a lot of complaints in this. John played a different set of games with a different set of complaints.
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to Bonk in general, I really hate the way Bonk controls. Specifically, I just really hate the climbing wall mechanic. I never feel like it feels natural. Just the way the button presses do, you're chewing your way up the wall or
I
whatever.
did struggle with that. Yeah, I struggled with
And
climbing
it
walls.
doesn't go away. That's the thing. Like I beat both Bonk's Adventure and Bonk's Revenge. So like I beat the entire games on the Game Boy, and I noted in my Game Boy Quest notes, I was like, I never felt comfortable. I just never felt at ease with the controls. So I have a big issue with that. When it comes to the SNES games, they really, I don't even think slippery is the right word. It has some of that weird momentum, similar to like what Kid Cool does,
Okay.
where it's like hard to
Oh,
get moving in the right direction, like you, but almost the opposite, like you're moving, like you jump and you're moving, your momentum pushes you forward way too much,
that's
but
not a
like you
good
can't pull
metaphor.
back. Yeah, so it's just kind of this very uncomfortable physics. Now the game design is simple enough and easy enough in the level design that it doesn't put you in a lot of situations where you're just dying because of it, or taking a ton of additional damage, but it just makes the game less enjoyable. I mean, the number one thing for a platformer for me is enjoying controlling the character. And then the number two thing is the level design. And I think the level design's okay, but just controlling the character is not fun in Bonk. It is interesting that you mentioned water, because Super Bonk has water, and you have all these different costumes and stuff. None of that stuff really felt like it controlled poorly, but just the general platforming physics were just not good,
Okay.
and I
Yeah,
don't like them.
I never felt like I struggled with basic platforming, but as soon as I got in the water, I was like, well, this is uncomfortable.
Yeah,
So,
that makes sense. In terms of difficulty and fairness, it's kind of hard to do that over the course of a lot of games, especially since we didn't necessarily beat all of these games. But I will say that the Bonk games tend to be a little bit on the easier side. Would you agree with me, or?
I beat Bonk's Adventure on my very first try, and on Bonk's Revenge, I game overed, but I feel like if I'd played it again, I'd probably beat it on my next try.
Yeah. I mean, I struggled a little bit with Bonk Revenge on Game Boy because I didn't realize certain enemies I could attack from the top, because I felt like that was kind of frustrating. The final boss has a giant spiky crown on him, so you'd figure, oh, it's keeping me from attacking him on the top, like, to make
And
this
it
difficult
wasn't.
now. So I died to him several times before figuring that out. But for the most part, I mean, these games are a lot more simple than your general games in terms of difficulty, and I just think they're not as interesting enough to like when you have a Kirby, like it's way too easy, but like it's got this banging music, it's really adorable, and it's got these colorful worlds. And Bonk kind of tries to be that a bit, but just kind of misses the mark, I think.
Yeah, that makes sense. How about fun and replayability? What'd you feel about that one?
I don't enjoy playing Bonk at all, so
I actually
zero
found
fun. I
I
don't say
found
zero fun, but I don't enjoy so many platformers I find to be more.
So I went into this expecting the worst. I'd played a bunch of Bonk games previously, didn't really get into them. There was one time, or there was a period of time, I don't know whether or not they do it anymore. I don't imagine they do, but the Game Boy speedrunning community was doing this thing where there would be like a game of the month, and they would
Hmm.
say, this is the game we're speedrunning this month. Let's all try to do our best on it. And one of the games was Bonk's Adventure for the Game Boy, and I tried it. I really did want to participate, but I just did not enjoy the game at all.
Yeah.
And since then, I had tried a bunch of other Bonk games, but I didn't really get into them. This time felt different, though. I was playing some of them, and I was really actually surprised at how much I was enjoying them. So I would say that my opinions on how fun these are has definitely gone up.
That's good.
If you're not trying to speedrun it, I feel like it's a lot more fun ultimately. This game feels like it resists against basics things you'd want to do in speedrunning. So if you're going into it without that mentality, I think it can be very enjoyable.
I think if you feel that way, you might want to check out Super Bonk, just because even though the controls are poor, I think the game design was a bit more interesting than the other games that I played for the Bonk series. Ultimately, for me, I like my platformers to be fun to control, and I like them to be challenging, and these games are neither of those. So for me, I don't think they're not fun. Like, they're fine. If you said, oh, you have to beat another Bonk game for Game Boy Quest and you can remove any platformer you want, like, I'd be ecstatic, because like there's so many really bad platformers, but ultimately, like, there's also so many really good ones. So if I was picking a game casually to play, not out of obligation, it'd be real hard pressed to drive me to the Bonk series.
Well, I'll tell you, I'm gonna kick off the score section. We started off joking about this game being a real 5 out of 10, but the more I think about it, the more that I think that that's absolutely right. I think that this game is at its core well, this game, this series, is at its core a 5 out of 10. I don't think it's challenging enough to warrant higher points. I think in some circumstances, this one being one of them, harder games would actually get much better scores.
Mm.
But I also don't find it unenjoyable to play. If given the option to play this or any other game, I feel like I'd have a 50-50 chance of picking this game over something else.
Yeah,
So,
it's so much. I wasn't joking. It is a 5 across the board. I mean, I don't know. The Super Bonk game had a little bit of promise that I might enjoy. I think it sounds like the TurboGrafx games maybe have a little bit of stuff that I might bump up. Maybe I could say those games were 6 out of 10. But ultimately for the series, it's just such an average platformer, and in a lot of ways that's just bad. Like, it's just not interesting either. And I think that's really the key thing. I think they tried. I don't think it's hard to articulate why it didn't work. So many other games take a cutesy character and put them in an interesting world, and blah blah blah, and it plays out really well. And this game just kind of joins that list of Chuck Rock, Joe and Matt kind of level platformers, where it's just like they're serviceable, they're fine. You're
don't hate
not
on my
gonna
boy
hate
John Mac.
yourself.
Don't hate on
Joe
my
and
boy
Mac's
John Mac.
probably better than what I'm talking about, but you know what I mean. Like, this whole there's enough mediocre platformers out there that there's just nothing about this game that grabs you and tells you like, oh, I gotta play some more of.
But that being said, we've talked about this on the podcast before about how I think scoring a game is insufficient to tell the whole story.
Absolutely.
And I would say that even though we are arguing that this game is at its core as mediocre as a game can get, I think if someone asked me whether or not I would recommend trying this game, I would say yes. I think that it
Wow.
is. I think it's the sort of game that you should play. I think that there are compelling, interesting pieces to it, but I don't think it delivers on the entire game. I don't think that you have to play one of these games for more than 10 minutes to get an idea of whether or not you're going to like it or not like it. I think you can tell almost just looking at it whether or not it's going to work for you. So,
I would say not to play it. I would not recommend it if I were asked, do you recommend or not recommend it? I just feel like the average human being lives about 80 years, only going to play X amount of video games, and I feel like there's better use of those years of video games than Bonk.
okay. I mean, yeah. So
But
I think
I will say, this is our typical segue here, but I think the speedruns of this game are a lot more interesting than the casual play. So let's listen to some of that forgettable music and then talk about the speedruns.
So it's not really possible for us to talk about speedrunning an entire series. There's just too much to actually tackle here. So we're going to really pare it down. I think the two things that I really want to talk about are my general familiarity with speedrunning Bonk's Adventure, which is mostly focused on the NES game. That's what's seen the most attention. But definitely the TurboGrafx 16 game as well as Bonk's Revenge, because Bonk's Revenge has also seen quite a bit of speedrunning love, and there's a little community around it. So I would say that those are definitely the two games you'd want to, if you're looking to get into speedrunning a Bonk game, the NES Bonk's Adventure and the TurboGrafx 16 Bonk's Revenge seem to be the most obvious choices. So getting kicked off here, let's talk a little bit about some categories and some world records. So for Bonk's Adventure, there are basically three games we're interested in here. There's the TurboGrafx 16 game. The world record is by DK28. It's a 29:45 actually. Any percent. The run is actually up on SDA if you want to see it. It's a pretty good run. DK28 is a really great speedrunner. He used to run the Contra Conference. He's a really, really talented guy. And that run is reflective of the hard work that he put into it. The NES games world record is by White Hat 94, big lover of NES games if you know him, and he has a 22:25. And then the Game Boy game has a world record by Jorf of 1637, which is like a 2-minute lead on even his nearest competition. I
Yeah.
think he started running this game around the time that the Game Boy community was saying, uh, let's run Bonk's Adventure, and whereas everyone else was like, oh, okay, he really went in.
Yeah, it
Um,
was about 2 years ago he got that time. It is interesting looking at this list of Bonk's Adventure speedrunners. It's a pretty powerful list for this game. You know, you got DK28, White Hat, and Jorf. I mean, that's a pretty nice triad of speedrunners that have done a lot, accomplished a lot in many, many games. So, you know,
it's a
but yeah,
great
his
cross
time's
section.
like a full 2 minutes ahead of second place. And there's like 9 or 10 runs. It's not like it's a 3-person leaderboard and he's 2 minutes ahead. So,
So for
typical
Bonk's
Jorf.
So for Bonk's Revenge, the TurboGrafx 16 game is broken down to 3 categories. There's a expert, intermediate, and beginner. So that's one thing we didn't mention really, was that beginner mode you only play the first world, intermediate mode you play the first 4 worlds, and expert is the entire game. So this is one of those games where difficulty is really only restricting content. It really doesn't change a lot about the game otherwise. Now, intermediate and expert, those are both pretty well run categories. Intermediate, I don't think has as many runners. It's a 1050 by Great John, and Expert is a really great run by Great John, a 2337. The beginner category is actually a really short category. It's about 3 minutes long. And if you're looking to get into speedrunning this game, that's maybe a good place to start. You get a real good feel for the controls, how the game operates. You can really sort of optimize it and get comfortable with it before you have to invest in a full 25-minute category. And Lat Mackey actually mentioned in his SGQ 2018 run as much, basically saying beginner's a really great way to get started with it. So if you're interested in this game from all of the praise that we've heaped on it, I would definitely check out the beginner category first.
For
The game,
sure.
good.
Oh, okay. I was just gonna say also the Game Boy run is by Mig Jims as a 1941. He's the only runner of that. A couple of these games don't have really a lot of runs to them. So if you're looking to run something maybe that's a little less optimized or maybe just less people on the leaderboard, you know, that Game Boy version's worth a check. Also, Super Genjin 2, Game Glitch Guy is a 3725. He's the only runner, and Bonk 3, Bonk's Big Adventure, Infinite Mystery as a 4815. He's also the only runner. So those are kind of limited boards going on.
Right. Did you mention Super Bonk? Blue
No,
Bomberino has a 2535, and I don't
no.
think he's the only runner of that game, but
No, he's there's a decent number of people on that leaderboard. So
it seems like the SNES games got a lot less attention. So if you're looking for something, first off, those are probably some great games to play casually anyway because they expand on the Bonk, in the Bonk design. But in addition to that, they also haven't seen as much speedrun attention, so they're definitely worth taking a look at.
for sure.
So the one thing that I think is really interesting to talk about for Bonk games is there's a lot of talk in speedrunning about different controllers being legal. The Japanese speedrunning community is okay with turbo controllers, and the U.S. community or the North American, Western, whatever, what have you, community tends to avoid turbo controllers as much as possible, with some rare exceptions where games have already been well established by the Japanese community with turbo controllers, and so they'll sometimes adopt those rules. We recently saw that with Super Mario RPG now allows for turbo controller in their speedruns because you can't use it to really play the game. You can only use it for text mashing. So they adopted some turbo controller rules. But what makes this really interesting is that the argument that's typically used for banning turbo controllers in Western speedrunning communities is that if you can't do it with the stock controller, then you shouldn't be allowed to do it at all. You shouldn't have to buy an expensive third-party controller potentially to be able to do something in a game. And since the TurboGrafx 16 stock controller comes with turbo capabilities, TurboGrafx 16 has always managed to avoid these rules. The games are pretty much built around using turbo controllers anyway, and so turbo controllers or TurboGrafx 16 speedruns have always permitted turbo, as far as I know. If anyone knows any exceptions, please let me know because I'm very interested in hearing about them. But I think it's sort of an interesting discussion how turbo controllers are sort of allowed in Japanese communities, not allowed in Western communities, but TurboGrafx 16 avoids it because of the fact the stock controller supports turbo.
Yeah, it's become a big discussion for RPG runs as well. Final Fantasy VII, a lot of runners have decided to start using turbo, realizing that they can't be on the normal leaderboard if they get a PB, but just that it's not worth the cost to their hands to mash for 7 hours. And I completely understand that. If I had a competitive time in that game, I probably would do the same. I just mash slowly and don't worry about saving that kind of time. But it really does. I mean, it's not healthy for you to mash for, these 3 4 5 hour speed runs, let alone 10. And so I could definitely see, 5 years down the line, we're looking at a lot of these speed runs and saying that turbo's allowed. It's interesting in a game like this, however, where it's a platformer and it makes much more of a difference in terms of your actual execution, right? I mean, we're not just talking about mashing through text, we're talking about actually, doing some sort of game action, which I guess in speedrunning really doesn't make a difference, right? Saving time is saving time, but there's something that feels different about mashing through text than there is actual. I assume you can use it to spin a lot faster
Yeah.
in Bonk, which is a huge benefit to traveling and making platforms you probably couldn't and stuff such like that. But it is built into the controller, so to me it makes sense. I mean, that's part of what TurboGrafx 16 made their console to do, right?
Right. Yeah, it's built into the fabric of the game design
Yeah.
for the games they made, so it just makes sense to support that sort of thing.
It's not the same as like maybe playing track and field on the NES, getting one NES Advantage button, which I did as a kid. Takes away a lot of the gameplay. But this is, I think this is a discussion that will continue down the line, especially for these RPGs, like you said, like an SMRPG and stuff. There's just no, the cost to your actual physical well-being on your hands is just not worth it. I mean, I know the world record holder in FF7 was, largely had taken the world record at the time because of his mashing ability, which was just god tier. And over a 7.5 hour time, he was saving a couple minutes mashing, and that's
Yeah.
good. That's a skill, but it's also like not something that's healthy. So yeah,
I ran a game
just
years
discussion.
ago. I ran a game years ago called Atlantis no Nazo, which
Mhm.
is this strange Japanese platformer. And I discovered that I couldn't reproduce the world record speedruns, which were by Japanese runners, because there's a part in the game where you can actually prevent enemies from spawning because they'll only spawn if you're standing on the floor. And so they use turbo controllers to jump consistently in a really tight space, so they were
Mhm.
never on the ground long enough to spawn enemies. And it made a huge difference in the runtime of this category. I mean, it was already a very short category, and so this really narrow, tight room, getting through that wall of enemies made a huge difference. And at the time, I couldn't reproduce it with my mashing abilities, and I couldn't reproduce it with the relatively cheap third-party turbo controllers I had. And so I realized that really the only way to participate in this game would be to spend money on like a Hori Commander, which
Mhm.
is a relatively expensive controller for the Famicom that would give me a more consistent mash. So
Yeah, it's tough. I mean, this is kind of a rabbit trail, but I intentionally don't run games that involve a lot of mashing, specifically like a Contra or something like that. One because I'm just not good at mashing. I mean, I'm probably below average in terms of the average speedrunner. I know at GDQs we've had that little mashing tester that someone set up, which is a lot of fun, and I think that's probably or maybe a little bit better. But compared to a TMR or some of these speedrunners that can just really wail on it, and I have hand issues in general. I did drumline, guitar, all these things for my whole life, so my hands are kind of all screwed up. So for me, I skip this stuff, but it is an interesting discussion, and it's a weird difference between Japanese and English speedrunning that people might not be aware of, or Western, like you said. I mean, Europe's the same way. It's really
right.
mostly just a Japanese thing, but it's cool that you can use them for most TurboGrafx runs because the controller's built in, and you don't have to buy any extra hardware. You're already using that stock controller and such anyway. So
Cool.
in
Well,
terms of routing these games, one of the big things is the animations, correct?
yeah, so there's a huge trade-off. I think for most of the speedruns, you typically prefer to get the power-ups versus
Mm-hmm.
not getting the power-ups, but there's definitely a trade-off you'd have to calculate for deciding whether or not it's ultimately worth it, because every time you get a meat power-up, you get this really long, drawn-out animation, and it does make you run faster. So the first at least in Bonk's Revenge, I know the numbers because Lat Mackey mentions it in his SGQ 2018 run. But in Bonk's Revenge, your first level power up, you run at twice the normal speed, and at highest level
That's
power
almost
up,
twice as fast.
Yeah, that's just under 2.5 times as fast. Um,
Yep.
And once you're fully powered up, you run 3 times speed. So it really does make a pronounced difference, as well as your attack ability. So it's beneficial as well for going into bosses and having extra attack ability. But that comes at the cost of these extra power up animations. So there's sort of a trade off to be had, especially considering for a lot of these cases, if you look at speedruns, for instance, of Bonk's Revenge, in the first world, for instance, the goal is to get the very first power up that you get and take it all the way to the boss of the world, which means as you're going level by level, you have to consistently find enough meat to keep it powered up. And so every single time you find meat, that's an animation again. And so
And different games seem to have different lengths of animations. Like some of the later games seem to have a little bit longer of animations, but
yeah,
the
they get
benefit does almost always seem to outweigh the animation negative because you take a invincibility power up into a boss or an end screen enemy or whatever, you can kill them very quickly. That, like you said, a lot of the Bonk games, the movement speed is just really increased by these different power ups. So it's interesting. It'd probably be an interesting routing exercise to figure out how to route these, but I'm sure somebody did a pretty good job of it.
Exactly. And most of the boss fights in this game, since it's a staple of the game series that you can flip over in midair and ground pound an enemy, most of the boss fights end up being either find a way to get to high ground, or if you have to take damage, because most of the time damage boosting bounces Bonk really high up in the air, you can use that to sometimes get above an enemy, and then you just repeatedly ground pound the enemy, which flips you back into place. But as you're sort of going up in your bounce, if you flip over again, you lose all upward momentum and you start going down almost immediately. And so you can really just sort of do it rapid fire. As soon as you bounce off the enemy, you flip again to hit them immediately,
Yeah.
and you do it really, really fast. When you watch speedruns of this game, or of either of these games, when you play it casually, you'll find that often it's very hard to chain these repeated bonks on an enemy, but a good speedrunner can do it rapid fire, and it's really impressive to see. So
Yeah.
that's a pretty cool element. My favorite thing, the thing that made me fall in love when I was playing casually, and I was like, okay, actually, I think I do like this game ultimately, was in Bonk's Adventure. I was playing it, and Jeffress Ledger, who is he has speedrun Bonk's Adventure for the NES. He said, "Oh yeah, you can actually get a lot of speed by attacking a flower from the side. So when you see a flower, if you attack it, it sort of pushes you back a little bit, but it pushes you back really fast." And so in the speedrun, what you end up doing quite often is attacking a flower from the right hand side, so it pushes you right, and then you immediately jump into the air and just start mashing, because you can maintain all of that speed in midair, and you can even maintain it as you bounce across enemies and things like that. So it becomes this game of just figure out how to stay in the air long enough.
Yeah,
And
which
that's,
makes these runs way more interesting than their casual
yeah.
counterparts. I feel like this mechanic of like mashing the headbutt down, flip back up, makes you hover basically, and the faster you can mash it, the better you can hover, and like you said, maintain your momentum. Also, just like bridge gaps maybe you're not supposed to, and chaining them with hitting enemies. It makes these runs pretty interesting to watch, I would say.
Yeah, there's a lot of vertical levels where you need to climb straight up, and a lot of times you abuse the flowers to do that. There's these flowers that when you jump on, if you time your jump off of it, it's like a springboard, so you leap really high into the air. And so figuring out how to chain those into flips so that you can climb even higher, you can really do a lot of pretty interesting platforming. This game has some interesting techniques that make it into a pretty cool speedrun. In terms of Bonk's Revenge, so Bonk's Revenge has a lot of little pieces to it. I mentioned before, Lat Mackey was talking about the first world. You're basically trying to conserve meat the whole way through the world, just so you can get it to last all the way to the boss of that world to make it faster. It also does really well against sub bosses. So a lot of the levels end with a little mid boss, and typically if you're fully powered up, you can defeat these mid bosses in like 1 or 2 attacks. So it makes a huge difference if you can maintain your power ups. Remember that you lose them over time, so you have to keep finding meat, but you also lose it pretty much instantly if you take damage. So if you're at the highest level of power up and you take damage, you go down to the first level of power up. If you take damage again, you go back down to normal. And so you can't damage boost through things. You have to avoid damage if you want to maintain that power.
Nobody wants to be normal.
You don't want to be normal.
Mm-mm.
There's also two significant skips that I'm aware of. One of them is in the warship level. There's this level where there's this water or this boat in water, and you're supposed to enter through the bottom of the boat and basically climb through the whole boat all the way till you get to the top of it.
Yeah, I
But
saw
there's
this.
yeah, there's a damage boost that you can do that was found by the taskers of this game, where you can take damage that boosts you really high up into the air and then grab onto the side of the boat and kick off of it to get to the top of the boat, which saves like 40 seconds. It's pretty significant in a 25-minute speed run.
Yeah, it's clear that you're not intended to get up to that point until later on as you move through the level. So always nice to have a cool little damage boost. It's visually pleasing too, so it's always cool to have, something that looks like a skip and it's not just,
Don't you hate
movement
that
tech.
in speedruns where you have some really cool skip, but no one will ever know it's a skip unless you tell them because it just
Yeah.
doesn't look like you did anything. That's the
Yeah,
most.
it
That,
looks like one. So yeah,
that's the
I
biggest
feel,
letdown.
yeah, it's the worst when you're like the things that people are most impressed of your speedruns are free, and like the hardest things, like when you pull them off, nobody even notices. So
Right. Those little frame perfect things that'll like skip a
yeah,
whole level and no one ever knows that you did
yeah,
anything except for when it goes wrong.
yep.
The level after the warship level is another level. It's got these radio towers in it. And that's the location of the other skip I'm aware of. There's an enemy right at the beginning, and you can bounce off of that enemy to skip pretty far ahead in the level. That one saves like another 40 seconds. So two skips back to back in successive levels that save a minute and a half in a 25-minute speed run. That's pretty big. So that's pretty cool. And Lat Mackey actually managed to get both of these in his SGQ 2018 run,
What a god.
which has a lot of really great commentary in it. It's him and the moderator of the leaderboard, both in on the couch together, talking about the run as they go. It's a really great run. I've included a link to it in our show notes, and also since it's the video we're using in the video version, there will be a link to it on YouTube as well. But it's a great run to watch if you kind of want to see. We talked about how mediocre the Bonk games are, but I will say that as speedruns, they all turn out to be pretty cool as speedruns. So you should definitely watch speedruns of this, because that will convince you why this game is cool. And the SGDQ 2018 run is a really, really great example of that.
Absolutely.
And so last thing I wanted to mention is that Bonk's Revenge has actually received some pretty recent TAS activity. Memory TAS and Easy Game 69 just recently posted a video, I think just a few days ago, as of recording this episode, of Bonk's Revenge in 17:18. So compared to the world record being, was it 23:37, that's a pretty significant improvement, and it takes advantage of a lot of those things we talked about, things like pushing off of an enemy, giving you this really big speed boost, and then trying to conserve it as long as possible. You can do some really cool things with that. I think it also abuses some mechanics where when you have a lot of speed like that, if you touch water, you lose all of that speed, but you can maintain it as you jump out of the water again. And so it does a lot of things that may not necessarily be human viable, RTA viable, but it's also a really cool task that you should check out. So
Sounds like cheating.
wow, I mean, yeah, but wow.
No, definitely a lot of fun. Check out some. I think the Bonk games are definitely underappreciated in the speedrun community, but there's also been some really great runners involved. Lat Mackey had this great run, and also, you've got people like Jorf and White Hat. Definitely check them out and see how you can take a game that's meh and turn it into something that's pretty good.
Yeah. So let's take a quick break. We're going to listen to some music, and when we come back, we're going to answer your questions from Discord and from Twitch. right, so as we always do, we love to answer your questions. Ever since we started doing these channels on the Discord, specifically for each episode, so people know what's coming up, we've actually gotten a lot higher quality questions, so I'm really thankful for that. So thank you, the listeners, for making that possible, and definitely keep them coming. We love being able to answer your questions on the podcast, and getting them in advance gives us a little bit of time to think about them sometimes. It gives us a chance to really curate them, so we're really appreciative. We're going to start off with some questions from Discord, and the very first question is a personal favorite of mine. This one is from John Carls asking, why are you making me play Bonk for the podcast?
It's a tough one for me to answer, so I'm going to pass that one on to you.
So this was my idea, and you okayed it, and that's how we ended up here. But ultimately, I think it turned out really nicely. You had to play Bonk, which didn't affect me negatively in any way, and I got to play a Bonk game and find out that I didn't hate it, which affected me positively. So ultimately, I would say that this worked out in my favor.
Okay, that seems fair. It still doesn't really help me out at all in this situation, but I feel you. I feel you. I'm picking up what you put down.
But didn't you play Bonk?
I did play Bonk.
So isn't that?
I don't know why. I still don't know why. That's really the key part of it.
All right. So our next question here is from Space Cow, friend of ours. Space Cow says, "How does it feel to play a speedrun on a console that has a turbo button built in? For once, I got to map the turbo button on my emulator, and I didn't feel bad about it. I didn't feel like I was doing something dirty. So that was pretty nice. How about you?"
I didn't play the TurboGrafx games, so those weren't the ones that I worked on. So I have no idea. I have no idea, man.
You're 0 for 2 questions that you can answer.
I've played track and field as a kid with the NES Advantage, and it made me feel like I could run real fast, which I can't do in real life. So it was nice.
So Turbo made you feel like you were better for it.
Yeah, it made me feel bad.
The TurboGrafx 16 actually had a lot of shoot 'em ups. I feel like that's, if you had to categorize the console by one genre, I feel like shoot 'em ups would have to be it. And
it's definitely one of the strongest, especially for collectors and such, for shoot 'em ups, and is considered probably the best system for shoot 'em ups, unless you're getting into like Neo Geo or something, probably.
And I think that's one of the things that's nice about that, is that because it had so many shoot 'em ups, and because the console had built-in turbo, I feel like a lot of the games were built around that idea, so they didn't feel bad about putting a lot of enemies on screen at one time and doing a lot of really cool stuff with that. Making it kind of hard to dodge things, and having enemies that had a ton of health and you had to just sort of chip away at it. Games just didn't seem to care, and I think that informs game design in a really interesting way. So
yeah, I would say that it's interesting that, you know, you can design a game around turbo and still make it challenging. It doesn't have to make it really any easier. Like if you make a good shoot 'em up built around the fact that you're using turbo, you can still make that a very difficult shoot 'em up. It is weird though, like if you're gonna do that, why not just design the game where if you hold down the button it shoots just as fast as it would with the turbo button? Like I don't really get
that's true
why turbo buttons don't exist. Like just make, you can program the game to do that, right? There's games where if you hold down B, you're shooting as fast as you would with the turbo button. So
that's actually a point that I feel silly I didn't think of. You're absolutely right. I mean, if your game should be designed around being able to fire like that, like why not just build that in?
Yeah. I mean, I don't know, maybe that adds an additional challenge. I mean, beating the shoot 'em up with mashing now instead of using holding it down. It's nice to kind of offer both. But you could always just make that a setting in controls as well. I don't know. I think it's interesting, but ultimately, you know, what are you gonna do? What are you gonna do? I don't know.
Other than Bonk, who is the best bald retro video game character? Asked by Bruceinator on Discord.
I've got some clear answers, but I wanted to see if maybe you want to answer first. I don't want you to steal my answer.
The best is Oddjob from GoldenEye 007.
Okay, sure. He's one of them. Karnov, my dude Karnov. First of all, he's killing it out there.
Yeah, shoutouts to Carnovember.
He's
something that
representing
should never happen.
The many of us out there that maybe don't weigh what a typical video game character weighs. He is representing the everyman's body, and
he's representing the carny folk in all of us.
So big fan of Karnov. I had one other. I'm trying to remember what it was.
Man, you should really write these things down, almost like notes or something.
Yeah. So Oddjob's definitely your number one.
I'm trying to think of other bald video game characters I even care about.
Bald Bull was my other one.
Oh,
Bald Bull is
I can see that one.
He's tough to beat. He does that charge. You got to hit him in the belly button, and then he
Yeah,
makes
he's got the stuff.
yeah. So Bald Bull's pretty lit, but Karnov's my hero. He's definitely up there.
Who
Bonk's
are
like
other
third.
bald video game characters? What am I not even thinking of? I guess Toad's kind of bald, right?
I guess isn't that? Like, I don't know if that's a hat or part of their anatomy. I really
Okay,
don't know.
that is. I'll tell you, as someone who knows the answer to that question, you don't want to know the answer to that question, and that's really you're messing with God at this point. That is like territory you do not want to enter.
Well, now I'm
Finding
gonna
out.
go Google search this.
Please
And
don't
it's
Google
not
it.
gonna go well.
Don't Google it.
I mean, I'm sure you got like Lex Luthor in some Superman game or something, but
Oh,
in terms
Lex
of, like, a main
Luthor in
character-
Superman 64.
yeah, yeah. So that's a good one, but
It's so good.
yeah. But I say Karnov. Karnov's the one. He's the man. Lat Mackey asks, "Why the hate?" I think we've probably explained that well enough. Mostly controls for me. Mostly controls for me.
I ended up thinking I was going to hate it a lot more. I remembered it very negatively before, and when I actually sat down to play him for the podcast, I ended up actually having fun. I said I was going to play for an hour to get, a cross section of games. I ended up playing for 2 hours, which I guess isn't a ton, but I was having fun and I kept going. So
Yeah, a more reasonable question, he says, is what changes might have made the game play more enjoyable. For me, it really does come down to like, I can play these games for 2 hours and I never quite feel comfortable with the controls. And I think that's really bad. If the controls were better, I think I would honestly like this game quite a bit. But I hate climbing with my mouth, and which is a weird thing to say. And I hate just like the slipperiness in some of the games. I don't know. I never the hitboxes in some of the Game Boy games also are really wonky. In terms of you don't really know. Like I think the SNES games I played and probably the TurboGrafx games you played, like. It felt like normally when you're hitting something with your head, you're going to win that battle and you're going to take the damage. But the Game Boy games, it always felt like a coin flip. You're just not sure if you're going to deal damage or get damage dealt to you, especially on some of the bosses. So, I mean, not minor things. Those are really major controls in hitboxes. But ultimately, you could take the same game concept, the same movement concept, all that stuff, and just fix those. And I think I would like them quite a bit more.
Yeah, I could see that. I think I would just like a little more variety of movement. I find when I think about platformers that I really enjoy, I like having a lot of variety of the ways that I can move. So like Mario games, you can typically fly.
There's a run button in some of the Super Nintendo Bonk games. By
Are
the
there?
way. I got to point that out earlier, but there is an actual run button.
I might end up being
the second
into
or
them.
the first. Yeah, I think you would like some of the Super Nintendo ones.
I think what makes me enjoy platformers a lot is, and it's probably born out of my speedrunning mentality. I think what really makes me enjoy them is when the game sort of has an idea of how I should navigate a level, and I can use a variety of cool mechanics to end up doing things my own way. And Bonk just feels like one of those games where it's like, we are telling you what platforms you're going to jump on, and you will jump on them. Mm-hmm. And it just feels like I'm just performing a mundane action when I'm playing games that way.
Yeah, they could have a little bit more interesting level design and such. I think the Super Nintendo games, at least Super Bonk, the first one, seem to have done some of that, but I'd have to spend more time with it. Bruceinator did ask, what are the cultures of Bonk? And we had a nice conversation about this before the podcast because this is prehistory, so there is no cultural influence, right?
Yeah,
you're the brain scientist, right? I mean,
yeah.
I think that's your technical title. And lawyer.
You can't have cultural influences if it's prehistory, right?
I don't think you can.
I mean, there's just no science to support that that's possible. So I don't think there are any, unless you consider prehistoric man to just be a culture of its own. That doesn't sound right to me.
I don't know.
I don't think there are any. It's clearly influenced by the Greek. There we go. So on Twitch, Andy J Retro asks, "What's your favorite mascot character from an unsuccessful console?"
It's like a really difficult question to answer because I don't. If you just
Very
ask
specific.
what is a mascot character for a successful console, I don't even know if I could answer that. I mean, so the Wii U was really unsuccessful. Were there any mascots on the Wii U?
So let me try to change this question a little bit. I might have an answer to this question, but I want to ask you sort of a spin-off question of this. not counting any of the major mascots that were very clearly successful, things like Mario, Sonic, Crash Bandicoot. Removing those and leaving the remainder of the mascot platformers, who is your favorite mascot?
This is a really hard question to answer off the top of my head. Like, does Kid Dracula count as a mascot?
I
I
probably
love
wouldn't
Kid
pick. I
Dracula.
probably wouldn't pick Kid Dracula specifically, but I understand where you got that from. I guess I'd count that. Yeah,
Yeah, I mean,
okay.
I'm trying to think. It's not an easy thing to answer on the top of your head.
Yeah,
This is like a
that's a little bit tough. I mean, there's like Bubsy, there's Arrow the Acrobat, there's Gex, there's
I mean, you
um
got Kirby and stuff, but that's
yeah,
like a big one,
Kirby is
obviously.
Howls. I mean, but that
Yeah.
one's definitely successful in its own right.
Mm. Mm. I don't know. I got nothing. I got nothing. I got Kid Drac. What's your answer?
So the only platformer I know on the CDI is The Apprentice. So, the only one that's not like borrowed from another license. So I'm gonna have to go with that one. Um,
Sure.
the little magician guy from The Apprentice on the CDI
Ooh,
is my
what
favorite.
about the little vampire guy in that SNES game?
Are you talking about uh Hugh Ackman? Go Ackman. Is that what you're talking
Yeah,
about?
yeah. That's a cool game.
Yeah. Okay, I could see that.
It's kind
I
of a
could,
mascot. I don't know.
sure, sure, I could see that. On
Spyro's cute,
Oh, Spyro, yeah. The
but that's kind of
Spyros.
successful. I
It's
mean, that's kind of
successful
hard.
in its own right. It's
Yeah.
kind of hard to answer because the unsuccessful ones are the ones that time forgot, and so did we.
And you also don't consider them mascots because like you need some sort of level of success to be considered a mascot, right?
That's true.
Like you
That's
can't
really
just be
true.
like you usually have to have more than one game first of all. So like if you came out with one game and it was real bad, you usually don't get to be a mascot. So that's a tough one for sure.
Yeah, we will disavow all knowledge of your existence, is what the game company says.
Yeah.
So Easy Games asks on Twitch. He says, "Which Bonk game would you most likely want to speedrun as a main game?"
I mean, probably one of the Game Boy games, honestly, just because I kind of want to speedrun as many Game Boy games as I can. So, but I think also Super Bonk seemed really interesting. I'd probably want to check that out. I
Okay.
would assume your Bonk's Adventure for NES would be your
Yeah.
answer.
Yeah, playing it, I really saw the appeal of speedrunning that game. It's very strange. The mechanic of like launching yourself off of a flower or whatever, and then trying to maintain that in midair. But that sort of like technical challenge of trying to abuse some momentum system and then maintain it for as long as possible.
Yeah.
That's totally my wheelhouse. So that would
We've got
definitely be mine.
one more from John Carls that says "nice knee?" question mark.
Yeah, my knee right here. I'm a
Yeah,
big fan of it.
nice
No,
knee.
it's good. It's
Cool.
it's it is it is probably the better of my two knees.
Nice,
Yeah.
nice. That's kind of bad that you play favorites though.
Yeah. They play favorites with me. This knee over here knows what it did.
So thank you guys so much for all of your questions. Like Chad said, especially the Discord questions. It's been really nice to kind of get to ask you all to post these, ahead of time and get people to be able to think. And you guys have provided some awesome questions. So if people are looking to see you, my dude, speedrunning Bonk's Adventure, which you've promised before God and country to do, where can they find you?
Well, when I'm looking for me, I go to look in a mirror. But if you want to find me, you'll probably be limited to just Twitch, Twitter, or YouTube, where you can find me as Author Blues. Where could you find John Carls, though?
You could find me on Twitch and Twitter at John Carls. You can find me on YouTube as John Carls1. Also, give our nice producer Brian Morgenthau a follow at BMorgsTV on Twitter and Twitch. We also want to give a shout out to our Patreon and specifically our Patreon supporters that give us $25 a month or more. We've got Tina Hacks, Mr. Pizak, Kip with two P's, and Drex DDRREEXX. All four worth your follow on Twitch. Great streamers, and we really appreciate donating to us. If you do want to support the podcast, you can find us at patreon.com/theframesavers. You can also find links to all of our stuff at theframesavers.com. We're currently pushing to try and hit $300 a month. If we hit $300 a month, Chad and I are both going to play Castlevania Symphony of the Night for the first time ever on our streams and do an episode on that. So if I think we're like $65 away a month from that. So if you're interested, go ahead and check that out at patreon.com/theframesavers. And we also added $1 a month. You can get our show notes. So if you like to see kind of what it looks like to put together notes for a podcast and see some of our references and such, go ahead and check that out. We also want to give a shout out to our friends at the Warp World Podcast. We have joined the Warp World Podcast Network. Now there's 4 podcasts for that. And you can find them at podcast.warp.world and all the places podcasts are found. They also have Warp World Historians and a new podcast called I Got One or something.
Yeah, I
don't
got
know
one.
what it is.
So it's a podcast where Jakku and his friend Johnny pitch new ideas for companies. Jakku owns like 20 companies, doing a variety of different things at a variety of different levels. And his argument was he has a lot of really great ideas, but not enough time to make them all. So he's basically just giving these ideas for free. So if you listen, you're guaranteed to hear some number of ideas of varying quality.
Everybody who listens has $1 million.
That's true.
Every day. That's what I heard. So
Mm-hmm.
check that out. Check out Warp World Historians and the Warp World podcast as well. Really great network, and we're happy to be a part of them. And outside of that, like I said, all links to all of our content's on theframesavers.com. So if you want to join our Discord, you want to see what we're doing on Twitter, you want to give us feedback, you want to know when we're going live, all these things, go ahead and check those links out at theframesavers.com. Any last thoughts, Chad?
Yeah. The Bonk games are average.
Yes, they are, my friend. Yes, they are. And sometimes average is okay. So thank you all so much for listening to our average podcast, and we will get into
Peace.